In the early 2000s, a philanthropist and environmentalist named Margaret H. Lloyd was looking to protect one of her properties that she called Hardscramble. She was looking to protect it into perpetuity, to provide environmental education, and in her words, help make connections between human betterment and respect for the environment. She donated Hardscramble to Clemson University for environmental education and research purposes to help encourage what she would call nature as teacher. The donation of Hardscramble and additional monies was and is still the largest private land donation to Clemson University. The Margaret Lloyd funds were matched by South Carolina's Smart State program, which uses state lottery funds to create centers of economic excellence in research areas that will advance South Carolina's economy. Clemson used the combined endowment to create a chair in urban ecology and restoration. Creating this endowed chair expands the focus of Ms. Lloyd's original gift into a faculty research program in urban ecology and restoration and economic excellence, with the expectation of generating grant dollars, publishing innovative papers, and graduating students. My name is Taylor Parker, and I am now a PhD student in conservation area management working under Dr. Betty Baldwin. However, my conservation social science project was the first master's degree to be completed under the endowment, and since 2016, there are now more than half a dozen projects being supported through this program, looking at everything from owls to longleaf pine, and environmental education to sustainable recreation. Hardscramble will be a nucleus for learning about the environment and human well-being for all ages. We are honored to have Dr. Charles Nilon here as our distinguished speaker today, supported by this endowment and Miss Lloyd's legacy and vision. Miss Lloyd passed away in 2014, but all of us here in this room right now, discussing and sharing groundbreaking conservation ideas is exactly how she would have envisioned nature as teacher. On behalf of Dr. Rob Baldwin and Clemson University, it is my pleasure to bring up Dr. Rodriguez to introduce Dr. Nilon as today's speaker, supported by the Margaret H. Lloyd Smart State Endowment.
Welcome, thank you, Taylor. I did my PhD with Dr. Nils Peterson at NC State, and he's extremely well connected. He comes from a line of professors. His parents are both professors, and we're all within the human dimensions of wildlife. And so I went through my PhD hearing about Dr. Nilon, and I've done a little bit of urban work, and this is the king of urban human dimensions here. I mean, we've got some royalty. He's also a distinguished wildlife biologist, and so we have this professor who really does. I don't know if you'd call yourself a coupled human natural systems person, would you? Okay, so coupled human natural systems, CHANS, is sort of the mesh between the human dimensions and the wildlife biology, and where we can look at the impact of the wildlife on the humans and the humans on the wildlife, and go therein. And so we have this amazing opportunity to learn from one of the experts who also does a lot of social justice, environmental social justice, and so I'm really excited to have you here, grateful to meet you, and please welcome to the stage.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the invitation to come here. It's great to first be invited as part of the endowment, and also be invited by Clemson. And it's nice to reconnect with friends like Mark Patach, who I've known, who was at Missouri when I was there, and Drew, and Sherry, who I hadn't met before, but I kind of feel like I know, and the Tukowskis, who I know because they're students at Missouri, and many of you know Ernie Wiggers from the Marine Wildlife Foundation, who was a Clemson alum and who was at Missouri, so there's a lot of connections. So I'm happy to be here. And what I'm going to talk about today is really a sort of combination of research projects that my students and I have been involved with, that all relate at some level to biodiversity in cities, to this concept of kind of everyday nature or nearby nature, and then finally how environmental justice, how they're all kind of linked together around biodiversity conservation in cities. So I will indicate where the human dimensions part kind of fit in, at least in terms of the research part. I'll try to talk about that a little bit because I have like 2 slides to directly talk about that, but I will refer to that. So what I'm going to talk about today are really these 3 questions. First, what do we know about biodiversity in cities? And this is going to come primarily from a study I've been involved in and continue to be involved in. It's called the Urban Biodiversity Research Coordination Network. Then second, I'm going to talk about the subject of everyday nature, which means that's what people experience every day when they see nature. And then finally, the idea of environmental justice and how that's tied to everyday nature and biodiversity. Okay, let's start out what do you know about biodiversity. We're going to talk about this from the perspective of spontaneous vegetation and birds. So in this case, we're not talking so much about people's yards and gardens. We're talking more about the vegetation that occurs naturally in cities and about birds. And this project started out as what was sort of the father or mother of the Research Coordination Network I'm involved with. And this was called the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis had a working group called Comparative Ecology of Cities and Towns. What makes urban biodiversity urban? So this is the working group. And we were tasked with trying to look at this question of, if you look at data from a bunch of cities all over the world, and you look at plants, you look at birds, what can you learn by doing a synthesis of that? So we looked at 147 cities, 101 cities where we had data on plants alone, and 55 cities where we had data on birds. And these were city-wide surveys that were not just in protected areas, so they were surveys of the entire city. So we looked at these 147 cities. You notice, of course, first looking at this, that what we're saying is concentrated in, do this right, whoops. Didn't do that right. So, another point. What we're looking at is concentrated in North America and Europe, because that's where most of the data are from. But what we found in there were, if you look at this nice chart, species richness, and it shows them in millions of species for plants, and then in hundreds and then thousands of species for birds with different scales. But look at that, they're showing by biogeographic realm, they're showing the numbers of native species and non-native species and so on. So I think native species, non-native species, and so on for all these cities. The way you see in general is that you look at this, that there are a lot of species of plants, a lot of species of birds in cities, and that unless you're in Australia and New Zealand, native species dominate those, the flora, the birds, the fauna, and the flora of those cities. And if you look at this a little bit more, if you look at species accumulation curves, it suggests that if you add more cities, you're going to see more species. So what we were looking at was that first, cities capture a lot of species. And they don't just capture common everyday species, they capture lots of species. And we also looked at things about composition in the biogeographic realm. And over here on the left is simply, here we go. Over here is a list of all the cities, and this weird colors you probably don't see the names of the cities, but these relate to the realms. And these just represent Asian cities up here, North American cities down here, and so on. So what we're trying to show is that you read a lot of literature about biotic homogenization and the idea that cities simply capture the same species everywhere. And at least at the level of species composition, we found that wasn't really true. We found that cities capture the species which are in the region where they occur, which kind of sounds self-evident, but we found that and documented that in the study. And then we also found some other things which are kind of interesting. For example, we were surprised to find that the best represented families of birds, for example, globally, are raptors and water birds and waterfowl. So those are the best, ducks. And so we found that the best represented species or families in these cities were not pigeons, stars, and house sparrows and things, but actually raptors and duck species and swans. So we found there's some sort of unexpected patterns if you look at this globally. And then finally, we looked at things like, well, what if you look at a global scale are the variables that actually predict species richness in there? And we found that the things which are the most important are how urban a city is, that is, how built up it is, and how far it extends, and then the amount of intact vegetation in the city. So those two things are just predictors globally. Now, we did this in part because we were trying to do this sort of global synthesis. We're trying to take a step back and say, what do we know about urban biodiversity? And then the really interesting question is, once you know that, what do you do with that information? So, first thing you might look at is, what do we know about species people care about in some way? So, we looked at endangered species. We found that basically 46 of 64 plants identified in the IUCN Red List that is being threatened with extinction occur in cities. We found that 33% of cities contain threatened bird species and so on. So we found that cities contain some rare species that are biodiversity hotspots. We also found that cities are very good at doing things like retaining exotic species and so on, and non-native species. So we started to look at questions you could answer this global scale that might be relevant in conservation. But then we started finding some things which are different. We found, for example, if you look at cities in the developing world, for example, this in Bujumbura, Burundi, we found that Bujumbura seems to have a very different pattern. So you might ask, okay, is there some kind of cultural link or socioeconomic or something that might say why cities which aren't in Europe or North America might be different? So what's going on there? And we talked about possibly different spatial patterns, different ways to use land, and so on. But we began, so you could use that global synthesis to ask questions about other cities that we might not know as much about. So this led to a research coordination network project, which essentially is trying to address this question. It's trying to address this question of how cities filter species and what that means in terms of trying to conserve biodiversity in urban areas. So essentially this says that if you look up here cities represent, there's a regional species pool. So here in Clemson, you take all the bird species, for example, which occur in the region. There's a subset which occur within Clemson. And those are shaped by things like species traits. They're shaped by human facilitation. And that represents what you see citywide across Clemson. Then if you look at a particular site, like we went this afternoon out in front of the library. And you go to the library over there, local sites, so it's habitat scale. Again, you're going to see additional filtering that's based on things like the city form, how the city's grown over time. You're going to see the role of socioeconomic and cultural factors. And then finally, you're going to see how people interact with species and the role of species traits, and that's going to filter species additionally. So, we're involved with a research project called the Urban Biodiversity Research Coordination Network, which is, again, sort of a global census type of project to kind of look at some of these questions. But that still leaves out some things like what's happening in here. That's all the stuff in the form of history, socioeconomic and cultural, species interaction, and facilitation. What's it actually mean within the city? And that's a lot of what my research has dealt with and what my students and I continue to work on. So, we're going to talk about everyday nature, and I'm a bad professional. I use different terms interchangeably, so I shouldn't do that. But everyday nature and everyday nature, I'm saying the same thing. But we're going to ask this question of how do these everyday things where people live influence people and influence birds? What do you see? So this question is, as you walk down the street in Baltimore, what kind of nature do you experience? And if that street is a different part of Baltimore, what's that mean in terms of wild? What's it mean in terms of your experience? We're trying to look at those kinds of questions. And this question about everyday nature really comes out of the social sciences and also out of design. So Rachel Kaplan and Stephen Kaplan are social psychologists at the University of Michigan, and they talked about the idea of looking at the area within a mile where people live, and they're saying that that's the place you have the strongest sense of place about. It's the place where you are most informed about the nature you see. It's the place you're most engaged in how that nature is managed. It's the place you care about the most. And then Michael Hunt, who's an architect, talked about how you can use this idea of this kind of everyday environment in design and conservation management and so on. So, if you think about everyday nature in terms of the processes that might shape it, you have top-down process from city governments to make planning and zoning decisions. You have, which influence what kind of habitat patches there are, what that matrix around those patches looks like. And then you have this, and it also shapes this whole cycle of building development, abandonment, redevelopment, gentrification, all those are sort of these top-down processes. And these are influenced by planners and designers, and they've also influenced by things which ecologists and landscape architects and urban foresters have done over the past 30 or 40 years. And you also have these bottom-up processes. These bottom-up processes relate to things which actual individual people do in the city. So these are things that residents or property owners make, decisions they make. And they're linked to what people like, what they prefer. They're linked to things like income. They're linked to gender, race, ethnicity, all the things about people. And they're also all influence people's ability to manage property, to make decisions about it, and then how they do it with the legacy of where they live. So part of this in Baltimore we try to apply to a project that's part of the Baltimore ecosystem study that we call Birds in Everyday Baltimore. And when I say we is Paige Warren, who's a professor at University of Massachusetts Amherst, and then several other grad students and other people involved with this. And we've gone out and looked at things like everyday settings of Baltimore, like urban shoreline, inner city, buildings and surroundings, these different types of places, and recognize that these, at least for birds, are different kinds of habitat. It's a different place for birds. We're interested in that interaction between first how people shape these places, and then ultimately we want to find out what kind of experiences people have with those and how those experiences shape what kind of birds might be there. So we start out, we've tried to look at these places as at a neighborhood scale, but looking at those neighborhoods as having sort of multiple scales within them. So you might have an individual lot, a house on it, where homeowners make primary decisions. You might have a lot where you have multiple residents making decisions, and then finally you have an entire neighborhood. And we've looked at them, this is going to grow the lot up, that at the lot level, you have residents making lots of decisions. They probably have a strong connection to what they're seeing, to the habitat and species they're seeing, and they're making decisions that might impact sort of population level. Okay. Next, lot level. You're looking at a combination of decisions made by residents and the city, where again, the city is involved, but it's still primarily residents making decisions. And then finally, at looking at an entire neighborhood is on the slide, for example, you're looking at a place that's primarily shaped by city decisions, ones where residents probably have the least amount of connection, and also where you're affecting probably more of a invasive species. So what we're trying to do in the Baltimore project is try to actually look at this in terms of designing a study about birds in Baltimore. And first, we've looked at individual lots, and we used, for this framework, we have 132 points, which are called iTree Eco Points, and this is part of the U.S. Forest Service's urban forest monitoring program. So they're looking at a series of data they collect every 5 years. They're kind of analogous to the Forest Service's continuous forest inventory points in the city. So we have bird census points associated with the iTree plots. We also collect data at the block level, where we're looking at something called the Baltimore Ecosystems Field Observation Study, which is some data that were collected in Baltimore, we continue to collect, that describe the sort of feel of the neighborhood. For example, some neighborhoods you go out, you see every single house has a burglar alarm sign on it. You look out, you see houses with bars in the windows. You look out, you see houses with nice yards. All these different kinds of things we try to quantify. So the qualitative measures we're trying to use to describe the neighborhood. And finally, at the neighborhood level, we're looking at land use and land cover. We're looking at a kind of ecological classification that the BS project uses. And then we're also looking at neighborhood at block level. We're looking at socioeconomic data, so data about people. So we've used this information on bird counts, and we've gone out, we do counts 3 times a year, every year. We're doing the long-term monitoring project since July 2005. At least 132 points around Baltimore. Baltimore looks funny in this picture because we stratified our points by census tract block groups. So we didn't, since we don't do counts in block groups where people don't live for the most part. And so we oversample residential neighborhoods. So this is our sampling scheme. And then we have a bunch of points right here in the middle. This is West Baltimore, and this is an area that Baltimore has the city of Baltimore has a project called Watershed 263, which is a stormwater management project, and they're interested in doing enhanced urban green infrastructure. So we were interested in how that might impact birds. We have extra points there. So what we found in general is, over our 15 years or so of doing this, is that we have patterns that look like this as far as bird species richness in Baltimore. We found a total of 87 species, which are about 1/3 of the species that show up on the Maryland Breeding Bird Survey, Breeding Bird Atlas as occurring in the Baltimore and DC area. We average between about 4 to 12 species per count. And so what you see is you have a pattern of species richness shown on the map where the dark colors, oranges and reds, represent higher species richness, and the pale colors like blues and grays are lower species richness. So you see a pattern that looks like this. And kind of keep a mental image of this pattern, like this is low, and these are high. And we'll come back to those a little bit later. Okay. And then we finally also looked at variables which are predictors of species richness and also abundance for different species. And they're things, so at the iTree level, U4 and iTree is the new name for U4, so that's on there. But basically, if you look at the contrast at the lot level between lots that have lots of paved areas like the sort of tarred driveways, rock, pavement, those kind of things, versus lots that have a lot of tree cover, maintained grass, and so on. Those kind of lots are different in terms of bird species richness. If you look at block level, how many houses there are on the block, and how many houses have trees in the yard and that kind of thing, and how many houses have shrubs in the yard. Those are predictors of bird abundance. And finally, if you look at the neighborhood level, you see that same pattern. where there are trees versus no trees, and then where there's building versus places with other kinds of vegetation other than trees. And then finally, we found some differences in socioeconomic. We see that there's some difference in species richness between neighborhoods where a lot of people have a bachelor's degree, and then those where there are lots of families who are black and on public assistance. So if you go back to the slide, so if you go back to the slide, which you probably won't, you'll see it again. But you'll see on that slide, we're going to point out those neighborhoods.
Charlie, you might work on the computer.
Okay. I got to have another one like this. Okay. So, this sort of background about birds of Baltimore. Now we're going to switch a little bit to talk about environmental justice and how environmental justice relates to everyday nature and back ultimately to biodiversity. So, kind of talk about where we are right now. We've talked about within the city. We've looked at what are variables which are useful in predicting species richness across the city. We've also done lots of work on models for individual species and so on. So we know what kind of variables relate to that. And we also know that there seems to be a sort of socioeconomic component to that. So in other words, we know there seem to be some differences between neighborhoods which have sort of well-educated people and the neighborhoods which tend to have more poor black people. So we're wondering what's going on. So let me get into this question about, could this be, say, a justice issue, and how might an environmental justice framework be looking at biodiversity use? So, to define environmental justice a little bit, this is the EPA definition. You can read it. But it simply says it's fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, who are expected in the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws. So this is a law, EPA developed this in the early 2000s. It's expanded under the Obama administration to cover other, and Clinton administration, Obama administration to cover other federal agencies as well. But also, environmental justice has a people component that relates to activism. So, right up the road in Warren County, North Carolina, in 1981, the United Church of Christ under Ben Chavis, who went on to be the NAACP president and so on, started a project looking at environmental racism, the terms in times called environmental racism, around the issue of some local issues in North Carolina. And this ultimately led to things like the People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, the 17 Principles of Environmental Justice, and so on. So there's a legal definition, but there's also a very personal, activist tradition of environmental justice. And then finally, there's a body of scholarship around it. So Robert Bullard, who's a sociologist, talks about a definition that he uses that relates to scholarship. So he talks about the principle that all people in communities are entitled to protection of our environmental laws. He talks about it in fair treatment. It means all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, are involved when it comes to implementing and enforcing environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So you know there's a subtle difference in there. There's one with a very legal definition, then there's one that talks more about the idea of how do you engage people, how are people involved, and so on. And along this line, there are a whole range of environmental justice scholars. So there are people like Robert Bullard, who is at Clark Atlanta University right down the road in Atlanta. There's Ann Whitson-Spurn, who's at MIT, who's doing at University. Beverly Wright, who's at Dillard University in New Orleans. Brett Williams at American University in Washington, D.C., and Chris Boone at Arizona State. So all these folks are scholars who come from a variety of disciplines, mostly not in ecology, mostly not in wildlife, who bring different approaches to this question of how do you actually study what might be environmental injustice, how do you identify ways of engaging people. So all these questions look around, you might think of being around Bullard's definition. So how you might use environmental justice approach to look at places like Baltimore with two social scientists, who are both sociologists, who come out of the 1940s. And the gentleman on the top is St. Clair Drake, and the person on the bottom is Forrest Hayden. And they are two sociologists who are at the University of Chicago, and were part of what's called the Chicago School of Sociology, which is a sociology focused a lot on the idea of how cities sort of go through a successional process, the idea of how cities grow and change, and how different groups of people interact in the city from the time they first moved to the city until they become established. So they did a book wrote a book called Black Metropolis, the Study of Legal Life in New York City, which is part of their research. And they have this nice map, so we're going to take a chance to look at the map. And what this map really talks about is, it says, let's look at Chicago, and let's look at the sort of everyday environment that Black people lived in Chicago in the 1940s. And they have some great terms in here, which we'll all go over. I was going to my class, you know what dicty means. Anybody know what dicty means? I just like that term. But dicty's like saying, it's like saying bougie. You know what bougie means now? That's what dicty meant back then. But anyway, they describe all these places, so they talk about the stockyard, they talk about churches, theaters, they talk about Washington Park, they talk about all these kinds of places in this neighborhood. And the idea behind this, though, is that this is sort of the day-to-day world of people in this neighborhood. And they're trying to understand what experience do they have, how do they deal with other neighbors, how do they this whole process, how do they come to understand within this neighborhood. And so I put this in here to say that part of what, when you're talking about biodiversity in the city, is that this is a setting that is an everyday setting where people encounter nature, where they manage their yards, where they're concerned about how parks are managed and so on. So this idea of saying what actually is happening in a neighborhood like this and might be relevant to conservation is pretty important. So, first project we're going to talk about is a study that was done through the National Park Service and through the Forest Service, and this is called Chicago Rivers Demonstration Project. And this is a project that, for those of us who talked earlier about Len Westfall and Paul Dobster with the Forest Service, who some of the folks in the Parks and Recreation program interacted with. Here, this is a project to look at green spaces near the Chicago River. So, a grad student at Scott Huckstead worked on this, and he was charged with looking at actually habitats adjacent to the river and wildlife associated with those habitats, with this idea of trying to understand how do people understand, engage with, use Chicago River. And it says rivers, it says Chicago Rivers because there are multiple branches and tributaries and all that. So all this is the Chicago River system. And we were involved in the project there. And this project back when people had mullets and various other things, we did this. We looked at small mammals and we looked at vegetation. And so the small mammal project was in a subset of these green spaces, which are woodlands, small woodlands, and these are all small woodlands, all sort of surrounded by neighborhoods. And we looked at, as part of this, we decided to divide the neighborhoods up into different categories based on socioeconomic status. We'll show you that on the next slide. So we looked at two different categories of neighborhoods, and we wanted to look at how the sites might differ, both in terms of the small mammal community, but also in terms of what the woodlands actually look like and what factors might be shaping how people use them and engage with them. So we looked at things like trash and dumping. Trash, litter, dumping means where people drive in and dump refrigerators and couches and Jersey barriers and construction waste. Those are different things. We looked at yard waste, where people dump. We use things like present dogs, cats, there's a trend where people kind of running around, and we looked at vandalism. And these were all publicly owned woodlands, mostly by the city of Chicago, or the sanitary district, which manages the river, and they're all within the urban area around Chicago. They're all surrounded by these neighborhoods. So we looked at a number of socioeconomic variables to do this from the census, and we used single-parent households with kids, number of children under 18, renters, owners, access to a vehicle, mean home value, percent black residents, percent white residents, and so on. So we did an analysis of these, a components analysis, which actually identified those variables, and then we used a clustering analysis to group the neighborhoods. So we had two different categories. We had, high socioeconomic status neighborhoods and low socioeconomic status neighborhoods, and the chart here shows the data for those. So in other words, very simply, high socioeconomic status neighborhoods had very few single-parent households. They had a relatively small percentage of renters. They had access to a vehicle. They had high home values and so on in terms of prices. So it gives you an idea of the type of neighborhood. And particularly important was the neighborhoods differed a lot in terms of the racial composition. So in our study, we went out and did small mammal tracking and did analysis of vegetation, and we looked at all these different categories of neighborhoods. And we found that There are some patterns related to both what species we saw and about the sites themselves. So the sites which were in relatively high socioeconomic status neighborhoods, even though the two sites had similar plant species composition, similar structure, the sites in the SES1 had less trash, fewer dogs, they had more small mammal species, more white-footed mice were the dominant small mammal species, and we had no Norway rats. The other sites, the socioeconomic status 2, had more trash, more dumping, more dogs, fewer species, fewer white-footed mice, and Norway rats were present. So we're saying even the sites which are all small windows around 1 or 2 hectares in size, which are surrounded by urban areas, which seem to be very similar in appearance, they have these differences which seem to be tied to things which happen in that neighborhood. And so it raises the question that there's something maybe about these spaces which are different in how people experience them, how they're being used, how other people outside the neighborhood might use them, and so on. So, now, the rest of the talk I'm going to talk about work we've done in Baltimore, and where we tried to look more directly at, again, places people use, and then we're also going to actually talk about a little bit about a survey that was done of how people use some of these places. So, in Baltimore to start out, this is a map that the social science group in Baltimore, headed by Morgan Grover, the Forest Service, made, and these show basically these are Google lifestyle clusters, which you can get from Google and all marketing data related things, which relate primarily to socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, education, and so on. And what you see is if you look at this and you kind of squint the right way, this looks like the university's of Christmas almost. In other words, these areas, this is West Baltimore, this is East Baltimore. This is the area right here by Johns Hopkins, which is a very wealthy area, and so on. So it looks almost like the same pattern. And what these are, these peaks in here, are the marketing clusters that businesses really get excited about. They're the place where people have lots of money, lots of resources, and all that. While the sort of valleys in here are the places that marketers get less excited about. So, what this shows is it's just showing our the socioeconomic data in the census studies for 20 different places. Now, so if you look at Baltimore, this also shows a similar pattern, that this is the percent of black residents by block group of 2010. And again, you notice that pattern of that graph, that figure looks like the figure that we saw with the bird data, and it looks like the figure we just saw with the marketing data. And a lot of this has a history that goes back to the 1920s, when Baltimore really started enforcing a series of ordinances that sort of excluded blacks, migrants, Jewish groups, and so on from the neighborhoods that were viewed at the time as being white neighborhoods. And a reminder here that when you read some of this, that at different times, different people have been viewed as being quote-unquote white or migrant or so on. So these reflect sort of policies of the 1920s that were designed to keep white neighborhoods white. And much of this pattern still is in Baltimore. So again, if you look at the same graphic with our bird species witness data, which you see again, you'll see that there seem to be some patterns which again suggest that sort of everyday environment of people in Baltimore in terms of birds and bird habitat is different. So the question then comes in, okay, what's that mean? Why is that? How do you do that in a management standpoint and so on? So our study recently in Baltimore has been looking at some vacant lots. We've had a project looking at vacant lots and birds, and now vacant lot bats. And looking with birds, Christine Riga-Brodsky, now is a professor at Pittsburgh State University in Kansas, was a grad student on the Baltimore project, sort of researching them. And what she chose to look at were residential vacant lots in Baltimore. This water, excuse me. So she chose to look, at residential vacant lots in Baltimore, which are a subcategory of vacant land because there are lots of vacant land. There are wetlands and there are forests and so on. She's looking at residential vacant lots. And these basically are places where there used to be houses, houses were torn down. And in much of Baltimore, these are fairly common. So they have to estimate that Baltimore has like 8,000 vacant lots and so on across the city. So there are a lot of vacant lots in residential areas like this. and they're part of this everyday environment. And vacant lots can be weedy, shrub covered, have lots of trash, which are eyesores, can be dump sites and so on. And they're across the city, but also vacant lots can be considered places that measure more attractive, have trees on them, they're green space within the middle of the city. So there's a lot of interest at the city in how to manage these places, how to manage them more as amenities. Because Baltimore is a city where they've had a loss in population. They're saying we're probably never going to be able to rebuild these lots, this housing, and in any kind of effective or sustainable way. And so they're looking at how do they manage these lots. So, the initial part of Christine's study, she looked at some questions about just where the lots were located in neighborhoods that have a high percentage of Black African American residents tend to have lots that look like this, and neighborhoods, again, where there's a higher median household income could look more like this. Now, you notice I'm saying that income, and then I say sometimes race, I said was kind of intentionally because Baltimore City has a large African American community, so that the large majority of the Black groups in Baltimore have significant Black residents. So, with the exception of the areas around Johns Hopkins. But wealthy neighborhoods and neighborhoods with fewer Black residents tend to look more like this. So Christine's research focused on what is the bird use of vacant lots, and then also what's the actual ecological value of these lots in terms of nesting success. Her research focused in on what's the bird community look like in these vacant lots, and then what's the status of these lots, or what's the status of these lots in terms of their viability as habitat for nesting for certain bird species. So she looked at a range of about 150 vacant lots in Baltimore, which ranged again from looking like places on the left, places on the right, and she looked at about 57 bird species that she found using the lots, and then she looked at nesting success for 5 species where she had data looking at nests. So she was able to follow nests over 3 years, over each year for 3 years. So here's what she found. First, set sort of the context. Most of these lots were what she calls either a vacant lot or an end lot. What that means is most vacant lots in Baltimore, either the entire lot, either the entire block is vacant, that means everything has been torn down, or there'll be a series of houses and then an area to sort of cut out of it. So most of the relatively large areas like this. Okay. She found 60 species used this lot she looked at, and she found that there's 64 species of trees, 47 species of shrubs, and then about 37% of the tree from woody vegetation is not native. Okay. She found that if you look at the origin of these lots, emergent lots are ones where you say, okay, we know that 10 years ago there was a house here and the house has been torn down. A planted lot means one where there's some evidence somebody's done something on the lot. And then these remnant lots, there are a few lots which have been vacant for a long, long time, and they have mature vegetation and some other stuff. And then how they're being used. They're being used where people walk through the lot. They're being used where they're completely overgrown. People never go in there. They're used as meeting places for all kinds of activities in this parking lot. So they're being used for variety places. Okay. And so what she found was there's a lot of variation. They're typical of a mix of grass, a few trees and shrubs, and they're not used much by people. Now, I'm going to jump in and say that one of the things she did from the human dimension standpoint was we did a survey of residents about their use of the lots in the neighborhoods, and we also did a survey where they had a photo book and they were asked to rank their preference for different types of lots in that book. So that's the sort of human dimension study that she did, and there's more detail to that, and we can talk more about how she did that later on. But she also asked people their opinions about this. So all these kind of features in here are going to show up in what people said about the lots. Now, if you look at nest success, she found first that for the species she looked at in general, she looked at robins, cardinals, mourning doves, and wood thrush, and one of the species I'm just blanking on right now. She looked at 5 species, and she found that there was 5 species that all had relatively high nest success, around 40.9% overall nesting success in these lots, which is good for urban birds. And she found that the number one variable accounting for that is shrub stems. So she found that these shrubby kind of places in the lots, which people hate, which we'll talk about later, birds really like. So, what she found from this was that there are certain features of life that people like, there are certain characteristics that birds like that people hate in general. We'll see that. So, our question about bird biodiversity, everyday nature, environmental justice, again, we've talked about this idea that you can look at a city as being important in terms of biodiversity. But when you start looking within cities, you see that there are patterns of where you see more species and where you see different species. We tried to look at this from a justice framework to say, can you look at this and say, okay, are factors which might create disparities in the city, people's experience of nature, are those relevant to birds? We think they are. So we think, for example, that certain features that occur in neighborhoods which alter what species, or which change what native species might be there, seem to also influence or are tied with where people live. And so we have this question. If you think about this everyday nature, residential lots, houses, vacant lots, small parcels, small parks, which occur in every everyday city, contribute to biodiversity, what are programs that work for you? And I start out and say that if you look, we all know the things like backyard wildlife certification programs. So those programs work. How do you make those effective? So we want to try to, so sort of the major question we're trying to get at is how do you actually implement conservation programs in cities to address these questions? And start out by talking about these activities are done by people. So people in cities are elected officials. They are local government staff. They work for park farms, things like that. They're neighborhood associations. They're developers. Okay? They're justice advocates, community advocates. They're conservation groups. They're people who run local institutions. All these different groups have concerns and interests, and they're represented by people. And they also interact in different ways. There's top-down aspects of management, there's bottom-up aspects of management. We tried to look at how it uses information. So I'll point now to our survey and the work that Christine did. And this was the most preferred scene. So this was the #1 scene for vacant lot Baltimore. And this is one which she said had roughly like 90% of the people that took the survey ranked this as their highest, as their preferred scene. And this is cut across neighborhoods, cut across the demographic variables she looked at, and so on. People like that stuff. And if you look at what people say in here, these were all the words. These are the words that we used in talking about this site. But what you see, it says maintain, nice, look, nature, wildlife. So people are seeing this and saying this is what we want to see because it has all these things that it represents nature, it represents wildlife, and all that. So one of the challenges that Christine was looking at was how do you take this information and say, okay, what can we do with a site like that? And with what she found about birds, how do you make those two things come together? How do you make a site that people value, say is important? And then how do you look at sites that you may not prefer as much, might be more valuable for wildlife? So just trying to understand that process. The other thing that people said sort of unanimously in some of the other parts of the survey, and also in another study we're doing in St. Louis, is that people want places that are safe, particularly people in neighborhoods that are poor neighborhoods of color and so on. People say, there's crime, I'm concerned about places. I'm not worried so much, I'm not scared of nature, but I want to be in a place that's safe. I want a place that looks cared for. I want it to be in a place that enhances my neighborhood. I want a place that I can actually use and visit and so on. So these are the kinds of things that are coming out of the human dimension part of our work. So, what Christine and I started to think about were that if you think about places that people themselves have designed, so these are two neighborhoods or two vacant lots in Baltimore that residents just said we're going to do something with. So we have one. This is one side, this is another side. These are two locations which basically the residents said we're going to do something here, and they did it on their own. These aren't done by the city, they're done by local residents. So there's two questions you might ask are, again, these are the kind of places people value. So from a conservation standpoint, and recognizing that these kind of places might have a conservation value, how do you work with those residents? How do you try to use the information that you collect in research studies and so on to really understand how you might influence what species might use that site and might more value from a conservation perspective. So with that, I'll stop. I'll be glad to answer any questions you might have.
Charlie. I was wondering in sort of in this realm of environmental justice, and really talked a lot about sort of the importance of words that you use. Where's the conservation community in the realm of environmental justice? Because we know there's a chasm there.
So I'll kind of answer it this way. The project, so if you think about the Chicago project first, the project in Chicago was actually funded by the Forest Service. And so Paul Goster and Lynn Westfall worked with the Northern Forest Station in Chicago, and they funded it, and the sort of intended audience were people who were conservation agencies along the Chicago River. And to kind of tie in with this, they were doing a lot of work with neighborhood public houses, other neighbors along the river. And I would say that probably almost nothing, because I think that there was a lot of interest in the river, somehow to manage it, but that's sort of part about the land area next to it. I think the Park District did do some work on sort of some restoration type projects in the city parks. They did a lot, but and then they did a whole bunch of things about people's perceptions of the river, about how they value the economic value. They had people draw pictures of the river and describe it and all that. And I think that part, I think, was where they had the biggest struggle, because I think that idea of saying that you could do things in neighborhoods and in different kinds of neighborhoods, particularly in neighborhoods where people might, not experience the same kind of amenities, I think it's just took longer to start to work with. I think in Baltimore, the city has a pretty active. They have a vacant lot management program, and they've been very interested in that. What Christine says is that they have a lot of interest at the neighborhood level. The city will be pushing vacant lots, and so what she thinks and what she saw from the survey was that lots like this tend not to really rise to the level where the largest city recognizes it. It tends to be more the more affluent neighborhoods where they're looking at where people say, "Oh, I really like these big lots, which don't have any trash on them and all that," and so they're sort of still struggling. Then when you get into actual conservation agencies, so I could say in Missouri we have a project that's kind of like this in St. Louis. And the St. Louis project, the conservation department is they want to do these mini prairies, and their local staff says, no, we don't really want to do this because people don't want to see that. They want to see something different. Then you think of the many prairies look too much like just an overgrown vacant lot, and they've struggled. And I think conservation agency locally understands that. When you get to that next level up, they don't understand it.
So there's still cognitive dissonance in the conservation community when it comes to what environmental justice.
Yeah, I think the idea of saying, exactly. I kind of get along with the answer, so I apologize, but I think that idea that definitely there's a disconnect, I think, between what people experience and what agencies see. So agencies want to do something, but they don't quite see how it fits.
Almost sounds like to me, listening to this, it almost sounds like to me there's this other layer of social injustice so these areas that you're showing here are not getting the attention that the nicer places are getting.
Yeah.
But it's almost like the community around these areas would have to take action before something could then be done at the city level.
Yeah. Exactly. So I think to refer to that, so if you look at the project here in St. Louis, I didn't talk about it all, but the project in St. Louis, one thing the city of St. Louis did was they were really active in working with the local neighborhood associations and with the local kind of community board, that kind of stuff. So they have, a lot of people in the neighborhood that we're involved with who've been to meetings, who've talked a lot, and so they've been pretty clear about what they like and don't like. So I think in some ways they've had a lot more interaction. But I agree, I think that the kind of connection is that the city wants, I think, a lot of the conservation agencies sort of expect we'll have a meeting and people show up and say what they want, and it doesn't work in the neighborhoods. It really doesn't work. You need to have more engagement with people there. And so there's a guy named Andrew Hurley in Richmond, St. Louis, and they've done a project called Place Stories, where they're asking people things like they have to go out with iPad and say, what place do you go when it's hot outside? Where do you go when you want to see birds, those kind of things, and actually asking those kinds of questions with this idea of saying, okay, how do you actually get the residents' perspective, how they evaluate places like this? And then they're trying to take that information, and so I think they work a lot with the city, and they've done this in several neighborhoods where the city is doing these vacant lot management programs, and I think they've been very, very successful, at least in engaging people. So they've been a lot more successful. Again, Baltimore, to be honest, I actually know less about because all of my students work there and I'm involved in the Baltimore project. I don't know directly how they're doing their vacant lot management project. Christine said, I think that they work a lot with neighborhood groups, but I think they're working more with some of the more, I think, neighborhoods. At least this is the vacant lot.
I have a good friend who worked with New York City in their Plant a Million Trees program, and she was telling me that she saw a lot of differences between like how people reacted to them coming in and planting street trees. Like she thought that some of the wealthier neighborhoods were very like accepting and excited about it, and then the neighborhoods that were poor were like didn't want the trees. So in your work, like do you often see this just differences in terms of economic status with how they want to interact with nature and what they see as like a benefit of nature, like what they think looks nice?
Yeah, I think one of the answers I'm going to talk about St. Louis again. So one thing in St. Louis, so I interested Drew Malinak, who's doing interviews with residents about vacant lots. And one thing that he's found a lot is that what people say about the lots in St. Louis, again, this is a neighborhood where they have 1,000 vacant lots in one neighborhood. So this neighborhood that has like a 80% decline in population over 20 years is kind of, so they got this real significant issue of vacancy and all those things. But one thing that he found was that when people talk about the lots, they want the lots to be basically mowed and nothing on them. And then when you talk to them more, they expand on that. But I think the first thing they talked about was that a lot of people don't like trees because they say, first the trees, catch to the lot, and catch to the lot, then people hang out on the lot and they do stuff. And stuff could be anywhere from prostitution to drug sales to loitering to all kinds of things. So a lot of residents view these as being unacceptable. Now, he said that when people talk more, they say, well, we know the lot, we like the lots if they're nice. So they say nice sometimes means it's mowed or it's maintained or it's well maintained, and it maybe has some benches in it. It has something that attracts people there. And then when he's talking to people, they say, I like hearing the birds in the lot. I like seeing birds. I like it because it's peaceful. So I think there's this idea of trying to find a place that people want a place. I think, again, the terms that he used, he used about cared for and safe and those kind of things. Those show up a lot in St. Louis. So I think that and the feeling about the prairie, again, was, I think, when they mentioned the prairie, where they're doing these many prairies, and the biologist from MDC said she didn't think those are going to sell there either. But that is the mini prairie was, that would get people, quote, used to seeing prairie. But a lot of people say, well, this looks like a big unmowed lot. So even with the wildflowers and all that, it still looks like a big unmowed lot. So I think some things, there just people said, it looks like it's not maintained, not cared for.
Yeah. In Baltimore, there's a lot of organizations now that are sprouting up, and they're going into the communities, and they have funds to basically spruce up open lots, but they talk to the community first and get them to open up and say, well, what do you want to see? Yeah. And I think that's really nice.
And I think that is, and I think the two lots in that picture, one of them came from my current graduate, Gil Carton, who's from Baltimore, and the one that said the neighborhood place or some quiet place, that's where she lives, and she said that's one, again, where the residents kind of did themselves, they got together, they got some money from somewhere and kind of, put all that together, so I think that's true.
How do you, so thinking about how lots can be changed or improved in some way, how do you see that influencing further gentrification of a neighborhood? Because I would guess that if you improve a lot and plant trees, and it will affect the people that would move to a neighborhood. Yeah.
That's an excellent question. So again, in Baltimore, I know there's a lot of development going on. There's a lot of sort of development gentrification going on in parts where some of these areas are. I think some just location, because it's right. Like some of the lots we looked at, say when Christine looked at her first year, were gone by the third year she was doing field work. But a lot of those are ones which are right next to downtown, or they're near University of Maryland and Baltimore, which is a big med school. So they're near places where kind of new stuff is going to happen there. But I think in the St. Louis example, we heard that a lot from the residents, that people said, oh, they're only doing this so because they're going to move everybody out, something like that. Again, some of it, what people also said, some people said, yeah, they need to do this because, their house has been vacant for 15 years in parts of St. Louis. And some people said, yeah, I don't care what they do as long as they get rid of this vacant house next door to my house. So I think there's a real mix of things. When I know that the city's concerned about that, and I know that they talked about, when we've had the meetings I've been to for the project we're doing in St. Louis, that did come up, and they had people say, and I know the residents have said this in the meetings, they believe in that, they're concerned that, especially for all the things that sort of obviously say conservation now, there's a lot of concern about that. And they talk about, there's a tree called Delmar, and Delmar is kind of, quote, the divide between North City and everything else. And so people, so they say, oh, if you're on the other side of Delmar, they do all this nice stuff. So if they do it on this side, it means people are going to start buying houses and redeveloping all that. So that's
More questions? Right, thank you. There's the happy hour at Nick's. So if anybody wants to talk to Dr. Nilon a little bit more, there's that opportunity. Thanks so much for coming, everyone. Dr. Nilon. That Tiger's Advance. Oh, he's playful.
I wouldn't talk to you.
I think tomorrow then. I remember it's too fun. Oh, yeah. I still
Normally it's just like we were only going by like
Yeah, I hope.
And the animal
I
behavior
went to a case
society.
and I was like,
Was
yeah.
that
Yeah, this
So I was there. I was there.
I did a
Sorry, I'll wear flannel.
Yeah.
I'll,
for
You can go to the podcast.
Orange, Texas, where's the?
I have no idea. It's probably it's gonna be a real case. So I think I have to send an email out, and I got it now. 15, I was still the host. So, which is perfect, it's fully out of order, just our side 15. And it was just kind of,
because they didn't tell anybody. Johannes.
Yeah, Johannes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's
We
a lot
didn't
of.
know.
Yeah, I was
That
asking.
happens to
Yeah.
be in our police department too. I try to keep that.
As long as you're on like East Texas, you know, or I'm gonna take it.
Oh, yeah.
well, it's like,
That's actually,
well, he's doing, but then
We have
instead
four
of
of those
leaving
in a
that,
row.
I think that's actually a little part of
so
that.
he'll show up.
Yeah, actually, it's Will do.
I didn't. I didn't know about Lisa that.
Yeah.
No, Johannes is a great guy. Can't help the fact that he's a
I'm
from
keeping
German.
Do you know about
eyes
the
open. I'm just trying to think.
You are actually
I can't. My husband and I, I married Michael Childress.
You know,
Yes.
beyond
We're actually going out of town very early tomorrow morning. My elderly mother now lives with us, and very seldom do we get to escape. So we have a 4-day getaway to Knoxville, Tennessee. But I am going to come down to the bar and drink